It's a delight this morning to welcome a dear friend, Professor Jenna Bednar, who's a professor of political science and public policy at the University of Michigan and a member of the external faculty at Santa Fe Institute. And we'll continue with our theme in this Reimagine series. And she will speak this morning to us about governance for human social flourishing. And I will let her help us sort of discern the distinction between human flourishing, as perhaps we generally speak of or talk about in certain contexts, versus the idea of governance and human social flourishing. Jenna, thank you again so much for joining us, and you are on.
Thank you, Tenzin. And it's really an honor. And I'm thrilled to see as people are rolling into this, joining this meeting today from all over the world. And that is just really an honor that you would share this hour together. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to get us launched, though, with 30 or 40 minutes. And I'm going to share my screen. So give me a moment to get that going. Okay, Tenzin, does this look right? Like, okay, perfect. So what I want to share with you is work that that is something I've been poking at for a couple of years, but I'm really focused on this year while I'm on sabbatical out at Stanford at the Center for Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences. The topic is governance for human social flourishing. That is, I'm a political scientist and I am a scholar of public policy. So I want to think about what role government might play in human flourishing. So first, thinking about flourishing. What do we mean by that? When I talk about flourishing, I want you to be thinking about individuals having a place in society, having meaning, feeling that their lives have meaning or a purpose in life, that they are meaningful to others, that they are loving and feel loved. So Aristotelians may call this eudaimonia. Sociologists will tell you that robustness, social robustness, comes from a sense of meaning and from these social relationships. Psychologists will tell you that the same is true about our inner resilience. And this sense of flourishing embraces what I've come to think about as four pillars, four interrelated pillars. Dignity, sustainability, community and placemaking, and beauty. Dignity meaning this status that you have, I suppose, or the respect that we have for one another, the inclusiveness, it goes beyond a tolerance of people in your economic and social lives, and at its best will extend to including others in decisions that affect your own welfare. So to me, that's a sense of dignity and respect for others. Sustainability, this is the question for our generation, the focus I think that we all need to have. How do we preserve the beauty of this earth for the future generations? But there's also in flourishing a sense of community, that we are members of a local society as well as a global society. And related to that, closely related to that, is the importance of place, that we are physical beings. We don't live yet until my neighbors at what was formerly known as Facebook and now Meta, until the virtual world takes over. We live in physical spaces, and placemaking shapes our social interactions. And then beauty, which captures so much that is so necessary for us as humans. Wonder, awe, curiosity, struggle even. These are all things that are important and human achievement to us as humans. And so what could government do? How could it play a role in promoting this? Well, our standard measures of government, how we typically, and I can say this as a political economist very often, when we say, how is a government performing? We talk about GDP per capita. So these are standard, maps of the data that are familiar to all of us. But if we think about the last presidential election, we heard a lot of angst and a lot of dissatisfaction with that. Bernie Sanders captured it really well. People understand that the economy is rigged, he said. They're working longer hours for low wages. All new income and wealth, almost all, is going to the people on top. And so we, even as at a moment when we had declining unemployment, and we clearly have that now as well, Winnie Byanyima from Oxfam had an incredible presentation at Davos in 2019 describing working conditions. I think that she was talking about workers in a chicken slaughterhouse. And she said, we've been told that globalization is bringing jobs. The quality of jobs matter. And when you measure unemployment, you're counting the wrong things. You're not counting the dignity of people. You're counting exploited people. And so we do have measures, and they're great, measures that move away from these standard ones of what's the unemployment rate and what's GDP per capita, to measure government performance. And one lovely one is the happiness index, and there's multiple components of it. But those jobs that Ms. Byanyima was talking about are the United States, one of the happiest places. And so there is no simple or single measure of flourishing, even a composite one yet. And so what might government do, even if this target is a bit blurry? And in the meanwhile, of course, here we sit in the midst of a pandemic that, as we enter into the winter period, looks even more frightening, at a moment when our world is increasingly on fire. And as Anne Case and Agnes Deaton so beautifully captured in their book, Deaths of Despair, we have people who are dying because they've given up hope. And so, their coroner report cause of death might be suicide or alcohol related or drug related. And what Case and Deaton showed us very convincingly in their lovely book of a couple of years ago is that these are all related, and they're related to what's going on in our political economy. We have left some people behind, and it's killing them. And so at a moment when we need to come together, instead, we're moving farther apart. And so here's just as a political scientist, there's a few ways that we measure people moving farther apart. Here is over time. You can't see it, but that doesn't matter. You can see these blurry clouds are members of Congress, red and blue, the US Congress, red and blue for the two parties. And you can see going back in time, I believe these data go back to the 50s, a lot of interconnection, a lot of reaching across the aisle. And then increasingly, as we enter into the most recent Congresses at the bottom, completely apart, very little going on in terms of cooperation across the aisle. We have grown increasingly concerned. This is measuring political polarization. We've grown increasingly concerned about what we call affective polarization. This is polarization related to ideology and society, but where it's not just rivalry, but it's actually hatred of the other side, where Democrats not only disagree with Republicans and Republicans with Democrats, not only dismiss their ideas, but actually hate the people who have these alternate ideological labels attached to them. But those are impressions that we have. When you actually measure people or survey people's attitudes over policy, we find much more policy agreement when you can remove the labels. And that's just what these two humps show. This is having to do with immigration positions, but still we have this perception that we completely disagree and that the other side is completely entrenched in their views and not even worth talking to. So what's our worldview? What is framing this behavior and how we relate to one another? Well, let's suppose that the worldview is that we need to focus on the economy, and that if the economy is doing well, then we do well. So suppose you focused on this GDP per capita or, stock market taking off, and you believed the rising tide lifts all boats. And so maybe that's your frame and the way that you would then shape public policy. That's the core principle. So if you're going to do resource allocation, you would engage in tax cuts and you would encourage people to be self-reliant, because all we need to do is grow the economy. You want to focus on the economy as a whole, and meaning measured by the health of the stock market, not on the individual. So in terms of redistribution, you might say, well, what is it that government can do to bolster the economy? And you notice that big ag is very efficient and that it bolsters the economy, great performance in the stock market. And so what you might do with government resources is support big ag. Okay. But, and there's a natural consequence to that, which we accept as part of this worldview, which is that only the efficient, economically efficient, are going to be subsidized in this manner, and that will mean, it's a little bit sad, but it's just a part of it, that the less efficient producers, like this is my local dairy in Ann Arbor, who until my boys went off to college, we literally had our milk delivered by this truck. Milk that was milked from little Jersey cows on a farm near us. But they're not efficient producers. That is not something that is going to be subsidized under this worldview. Well, there was an article in the Lancet a year or two ago that related big ag to some terrible outcomes: overnutrition, obesity, undernutrition, because it leads to the production of less nutritious food, emphasis on wheat and corn over more nutritious products, and it is related to climate change. Some of these terrible things that are contrary to those goals that I laid out earlier about human flourishing. So at the very least, what you would want to do is remove those subsidies, but the subsidies are at the tune of $20 billion a year in the United States. But if what you really wanted to do is eliminate these bads, maybe what government ought to be doing is focusing on eliminating these bads. For sure, you'd want to take big ag out of the equation. But that's not our current worldview. And our current worldview is killing us, literally. So what should we do? Well, one approach to solving some of these huge problems that we have, the conventional wisdom says that big problems require big solutions. That is, you've got to regulate. if you want to arrest climate change, which we need to do, it needs to come from the top because this is global. In other words, you can't stop climate change from recycling. Sweet as recycling is, it's not going to make a difference. But we just finished, the COP26, these high level negotiations over global scale regulation. And we see that while we made headway, I use we in a very, very broad sense. I had not, I was just reading the newspaper like most of us. But while we made headway, it wasn't where we need to go. And so why can't we make decisions, commit to behaviors that are in our collective interests? Again, it's this problem of our worldview, of this sense that we value one another based on what we can get out of that exchange with one another productively. That is, we have a transactional sense of the importance of others to us and how it might contribute to this economy. But there's some other things that happened at COP26 that I want to highlight. So big business took home a different message from what's been communicated about the agreements between the nation states. And this is just a report from McKinsey, but all kinds of businesses are sharing similar reports and similar takeaways. They said COP26 made a net zero a core principle for business. And so here's how leaders can act, they say, and lay out a plan. There are achievements or recognition similar to this, not just consulting companies, but by in finance, in business, in philanthropy, and other organizations. This matters because these are actually the producers of emissions and the funders of emission producing activity. And if the targets are met that they are at least expressing a commitment to at this point, then there will be significant reduction beyond what the nation states were able to commit to in the negotiations. So business has shown, at least in terms of their language, has shown a willingness to go farther than what they are mandated or required to do by the nations. And the same is true, just to bring back in some of these other pillars in that definition of human social flourishing that I laid out in the beginning. The same is true for dignity of work, for racial and gender equality. Business leadership is somewhat ahead of law and regulation, at least in the United States. And so for me as a political scientist, I mean, of course, it's lovely to hear them say these things and to see this movement. But the question really is, what's the accountability? What holds them to it? And if we don't yet have a political will to require them to meet these environmental standards or equity standards, we have other means as consumers, as employees. Turns out employees are a very powerful force in shaping the actions of their employers, especially as employers recognize how competitive it is to hire the brightest employees. And it's exciting to see how much in universities, how much our students are demanding courses that describe how to advance sustainability goals and describe how to advance equity goals. So we see this movement We see this change happening. How do we make it? It's this, what I see happening is this pushback against what our current political economy is emphasizing about us. So we as humans, if we think about our innate selves, of course we are innately self-interested. And our current political economy is really feeding that self-interest, this competitiveness. But we are also, in our core, pro-social. We also care about others. And our current political economy hasn't given us an opportunity to express that fully. And in fact, it's squashed it. But what I'm seeing is that it's blossoming back up. And so the question is, what can government do absent and to nurture that so that it does become something that we are willing to act on at a global scale? So here I want to spend the rest of the time that I have describing some social science approaches to thinking about how to nurture this pro-sociality. And I'm going to describe two related modeling approaches, theoretical approaches. One is norm change and the other is collaboration. So norms. When we're thinking, I've been using the word worldview for a while now in the talk, but what a worldview is backed by public expectations of one another's behaviors. That's essentially what, when we talk about norms, that's what we're talking about. These are non-coerced behaviors that result from what we expect others to do, and then we act in accordance. They are socially enforced rather than being enforced through some third party like the government. And I'm going to describe in brief some work by Damon Centola on this. Okay. Before I get to it, I want to talk about why norms are so important. So I'm imagining that most people who would tune into a talk at MIT sponsored by this Dalai Lama Center are already familiar with Garrett Hardin's work on the tragedy of the commons, this concern that with resources that are held in common, we are going to act on our native instincts to behave in a self-interested way, and we will, as individuals, and therefore in aggregate, overexploit the resources beyond their renewability. So in this paper that was extremely influential, published in 1968, he said, technology is limited, can't eliminate this root problem, which is human nature. And so basically what we have to do is limit freedom of use, freedom of access to the commons. We need coercion. To eliminate exploitation, we have to eliminate the commons. That is, we can't allow people to make these choices. And one of my heroes, woman whose work has massively influenced mine, Lynn Ostrom, is admired for saying, wait, I don't know, I've been studying an awful lot of community-held resources, common pool resources, and see communities working together to manage these successfully. And she has a set of 8 principles that if these are met, these define communities that are able to successfully manage their community resources. Some of the principles, though, are being highly inclusive. Every individual, so first the community itself defines the problem, it defines the solution, and it figures out how to implement it. So this isn't the World Bank coming in saying, hey, here's how you're going to take care of this problem. It's a solution a remedy that's devised by the stakeholders themselves. and they participate in solving it. The community, there's member accountability. The members are known to one another within this community. And part of what makes it successful is a sense of flexibility and discretion. So since the community members know one another, they have expectations about one another's behavior. If they see deviations, there is a richness to the relationship that helps them to understand why someone might have deviated, see whether there are reasonable reasons for that exception. For example, you were supposed to work in the fields and you were sick. And so therefore, maybe we should allow for that. And in fact, take care of you, help overcome your challenges so that you can return to being a productive member and successfully help manage this resource. And to the moment that she died, in those last few years of her life, she said, I can see how this works in intimate relationships, in intimate communities where people know one another. How do we scale this? How do we take these principles of inclusiveness, of every person in the community mattering, of understanding one another's vulnerabilities, and trying to figure out how to meet those needs so that we can continue to say every person matters, to solving our problems? How do we scale that? Well, the question is, why would scale even be a problem? Going back to Hume, this is back to the commons. Two neighbors may agree to drain a meadow, which they possess in common, because it's easy for them to know each other's mind. And each may perceive that the immediate consequence of failing in his part is abandoning the whole project. So you work because you don't want to let the other person down. But it's difficult and indeed impossible that 1,000 persons should agree in any such action, right? So this is kind of depressing in a Humean sense. So what is it that he's saying is a problem? He seems to be pointing us to a problem of accountability, or perhaps he's also pointing us to a problem of diffuse benefits. That is, my work, my labor is not going to be paid off well enough for me to make it worth my time to do this. Those are both certainly problems. But one thing that Lynn Ostrom gets us to think about is maybe it goes a little bit beyond that. And there's also a sense of sociality that is needed even as we scale, even as we take it up bigger. We need to recognize these social relationships that we have with one another. And so just to let you know about some models that I'm really interested in these days, I've been reading a lot of Damon Centola's work, sociologist who works with social networks. And he gets us to think social networks. We've often, from Granovetter on, we've been thinking about how information diffuses across social networks, but norms are not, it's not the same as information, because it's not that you receive information and then immediately act on it. In a lot of cases, changing your behavior, that's a much higher threshold, much higher bar. Some of the challenges to changing behavior include just the uncertainty. How will everybody else respond? Because if they're not doing the same thing, then my effort won't be worth it. Or is this information even credible? Can I trust it? Et cetera. And so he describes this sense of complex contagion. That is, in order for you to act on information, you need to have multiple touch points for receiving that information. And so what he's given us is a different way of thinking about this structure of society that helps norms to emerge and diffuse, that require these thick relationships like what Lynn Ostrom was describing, where you know much more about those around you. And so you have a sense of trust. And then within these clusters, norms can change. And then we need to construct these wide bridges between clusters so that they might diffuse in a thick way toward another cluster. Anyway, stay tuned. The science is in development, but I find it very exciting. What I'm going to do I have about 10 minutes, Tenzin? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to now shift to something else that I've been working on quite a lot, which is thinking about a science of collaboration. And I'm doing this with a set of scholars sponsored by the Strungman Forum in Frankfurt, but these are scholars from around the world and across disciplines. And we're trying to bring together understanding of what causes people to work together successfully toward a shared goal, which is how we're defining collaboration. Shared goal might be saving the planet. So it's very much in line with our concerns in this talk. And we had, so the Strungman Forum is a fascinating place where they bring together 40 or 50 people who have never really worked together before for a week in a way that's very orchestrated, set up by a program a committee, which is the people on this page, to focus conversations so that by the end of the week, we actually are writing papers together and try to build a new science. Anyway, so we were super excited about this. We had our planning session in the fall of 2019. We're going to gather everybody together in the summer of 2020, and you know what happened. But we felt that the work that we were doing was so exciting and important that we didn't want to lose momentum. And so what we have done in the meanwhile, until it's safe for us all to gather, and we hope it's going to be next May, is that we are conducting a series of interviews, which we are soon to release as podcasts, of people from different industries, asking them about collaboration in their industry. What is it? How do they define it? What are the structures that cause it to be successful? What happens when collaboration fails? What tends to cause it to fail? And how do you recover from that failure? And so I'll just share with you a couple of the interviews that we've done. First, with my colleague at University of Michigan, Bob Axelrod, who is, I guess, really one of the foundational thinkers in our understanding of cooperation. And when we shifted him from thinking about cooperation to collaboration, he immediately shifted from being a game theorist and thinking in terms of incentives to thinking in terms of human relationships, and was emphasizing, as we interact with one another, that we need to set aside incentives, like where is this going, and what are our measurables, our performance indices, and instead that we be human, that we be playful, that we lighten up and have fun in our collaboration with one another. Really surprised us. Another interview that we did is with the director of the Center for Advanced Study, where I am and where Tenzin has been. And she described to us some of the work that she has done on successful labor organizations, on unions. And she describes a successful union as one that is able to build, this phrase I love, a community of fate, where you're able to see one another, even as strangers, as fellow humans. And so what will cause people to work on behalf of others, and the book that she wrote with a former student of hers, John Alquist, is called In the Interest of Others. What will cause people to work for others, this pro-social sense, is when they're able to be thinking about others and caring about others as fellow humans. She said it's a moral process. This is not just about aligning incentives. That institutions do play a role. They play a role, they could support this growth of pro-sociality by helping to catch the free riders, and also creating spaces for interaction where these union members, at least on a local level, can get to know one another as fellow humans, not just in the work environment, but there are community halls and opportunities for recreation together. And she said it literally changes the self, that you come to feel that your participation is important, that you are needed. And the last one that I want to describe is an interview that we did with Naina Agrawal, who is a teenager, actually just this year now, off on her way to college, but when we interviewed her, she was a senior in high school, and one of the national leaders of this youth movement, the Sunrise Movement, which is a pro-environmental advocacy movement, teenagers who aren't yet old enough to vote, but would like us to know that they're waiting and they would really like to have a planet to work with when they become adults. And so we, this is Naina right here. She described to us this movement, how it's structured. It's fully decentralized, which I thought was really interesting. There's about 500 local hubs, and these local hubs set their own goals. There's a national office that provides training, and it sets some core principles. But the local hubs are the ones who determine for themselves what challenges there are, what they might do to participate, and how they can organize themselves, making the most of every person in their membership to lead toward action locally that will make a difference. And so she shared with us a moment. This is a brainstorming session, not just of the Sunrise Movement, but a number of youth-based movements who came together in advance of the youth climate strike, which was in September of 2019. And so there was this, I think they gathered in Iowa in August of 2019 to really lay out, these different movements coming together, lay out their goals. And she said it was kind of fraught because they couldn't come to an agreement about what their messaging was going to be, because each organization had its own set of priorities. And then there was this moment in the middle of the night, she said, one person said, wait a minute. And she went up to the whiteboard and erased everything and drew this flower. And I know it's hard to see because this is a photo of the actual whiteboard, but you see that some of them, she drew a flower, and each one of these petals is a different expression of the core urgency felt by the different movements, right? So some were fighting against big ag, some were fighting against environmental racism, some wanted to protect and restore the biodiversity, some were really concerned about climate refugees, some were concerned about indigenous lands. And she said, wait, this is all stemming from the same set of problems. We've all been talking about the same set of woes: racism, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism. And this is all a part of a bigger picture, which is captured by the Green New Deal. And so they were able to see that they didn't have to give up on their own sense of purpose to find shared meaning and a shared vision. And she said, once this went up on the board, there was just this explosion in the room, such excitement, such passion. And then they could go out together to successfully protest because they can't vote, so they can protest. So the question is, how do you sustain this? And we asked her a lot of questions about how this organization is structured, because this is a lot of passion, but how do you keep that passion moving forward? And especially in something as interesting as a youth movement where you have natural turnover as students age. Like Nana is now going off to college, so you have new high school students coming in. And she said, trust is key to the success of these hubs. They have to build trust. They do that by building a sense of connection, care, having fun together. And so the structure of the organization is there to facilitate trust. It helps to maintain the values. It maintains this balance between all of the energy at the local level and the sophistication, I guess, at the national level. Sometime in a deeper talk, I can talk about my work on robustness, but this organization is set up in a way that includes typical systemic robustness features of diversity, modularity, and redundancy. So you have recovery from failure. All right, so just to sum up some of the things that we're starting to capture in this project on collaboration, we're seeing that it's successful when it's radically inclusive, including in the goal setting. When you have human connection more than just interaction for material gain, going far beyond we interact with one another and we value one another because of the transaction. Trust is key. And then these institutions support collaboration to make trust possible. So what can you do? Can you scale this? What some social scientists are arguing very importantly is that for successful, sustained collaboration, these intrinsic values that I've been emphasizing as I reported out what we're learning in the collaboration project matter much more than the material reward. But our public policy tends to focus on material incentives. That is, think about your relationship with government. And it's so often defined in terms of how are we taxed and how is it spent? Are you a taker in the sense of you receive redistribution from the government? Or are you a giver in the sense that you're taxed more than you perceive reception? And that's how we evaluate our government. But instead, we can think, what could government do to maybe leverage the positive externalities? One of my colleagues at Michigan in the Public Policy School, Caitlin Ramey, is doing some great work, interesting work on how pro-environmental behavior leads to more pro-environmental behavior. That is, if people are participating in small ways to improving the environment, reducing their personal carbon load, then and especially when they're not, it's not because they're paid to do it, but because you are motivating this sense of processuality that is living within each of us. That not only does it lead to you being willing to engage in increasingly costly behavior because you find it intrinsically rewarding, but it also leads to being more likely to support larger scale regulation, public policy that will create those mandates. And so you might be saying, Jenna, are you saying that we can save the planet by recycling? No, what I am saying is that maybe there's a different role for government. And we can think about government as taking maybe an indirect approach, setting up opportunities to trust one another, find ways of supporting meaningful participation, creating a sense of need. instead of coercion, which is what we classically think of government as doing with regulation and mandates, can it foster collaboration? Can we tap into this native sense of human volition and wanting to be a part of society and participate? And do it by making this, by increasing our sense of agency, by allowing each of us to define problems and solutions and ways that we are going to implement those solutions, because we need a message that each person matters to us. Massive set of takeaways. I said, create human flourishing, protect the commons, even the global commons, by moving from coercion to collaboration, emphasize human agency, connectedness, inclusion, embrace diversity and complexity with local exploration in these very thick social environments, and then global exploitation of what we learn, prioritizing intrinsic motivation over material incentives, capture that capacity that we have to create positive externalities, and that trust is cornerstone. Or maybe to make it more simple, here's the tweet from the talk. Government can't mandate human flourishing because flourishing is a quality of the individual and society, participating fully, meaningfully, and pro-socially, and feeling needed by others. But it can remove barriers to participation. It can create spaces that encourage pro-sociality to grow. And maybe most importantly, it can remove the risk of trusting others. And so maybe I'll just give the last word to Nena. We asked her at the close of our interview, she said, at the close, she said, we need to move from a mindset of scarcity to one of abundance. And with that comes a willingness to collaborate. And we said, can we meet the challenge of climate change? And she said, yes, we can. And then we said, will we? And she said, we'll see. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you so much for sharing your work. And folks, again, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll get to it. Jenna, one of the things that you kept bringing up in this framework of social flourishing is trust. Mm-hmm. And trust historically has been one of the slowest things to build. Yeah. You know, even in a homogeneous community, even in a homogeneous society, in some ways, it has been slowest thing to build. Given all that you're observing in terms of how polarized society has become, how easy it is to give into this sense of tribalism, what would some of your suggestions be in terms of this idea of scaling trust? Because we are entering an era of urgency, meaning that speed does matter. Scale does matter for certain things. But can we actually build trust at scale and that fast?
I don't know, Tenzin. That's what I'm working on. I mean, it's so, it's, you know, that is the question. The one you're asking is the question that is motivating me these days. And gosh, if I had the answer, I would have led with that, because I wouldn't spend all my time explaining myself. I would say, here's what we need to do. Here's the prescription. Now, please get to it, because we needed to do this yesterday. But I do know that it isn't going to come. We aren't going to be able to get there without involving everybody. Mm-hmm. And that has seemed to be the approach. I mean, we think if we're gonna move fast, it's going to be big, and it's going to be through massive policy change today. And we're not going to get massive policy change today until we have public will. And the public will isn't going to come until all of these other pieces that I built up during the talk come. And so that's why, you know, I'm trying to think in terms of what we're learning about the emergence and diffusion of pro-social norms, and about what has made collaboration successful, and are there lessons from that that can be scaled? So I'll work faster.
No pressure. There's a question about, you know, certain kinds of governments that are actually, you know, driven by a sense of control. They're rarely driven by the kinds of propositions that you have proposed: dignity, beauty, and so on. So one of the questions that is being asked here is, do you think that there are more effective ways of bringing ideology of love and beauty versus strong hand and control in such an environment, especially where there is long history of it?
Yeah. So I am, and I actually would beg all of you, if you have examples, because this is one thing I'm trying to do, is find examples where people have seen environments that have shaped prosociality. And at the risk of really messing everything up, I'm going to try. Well, I won't do it again. I have another thing I could show you. So for example, we have some scientists have looked at the effect of green space, people's access to green space, and does that shape prosociality? And they had populations with 6 different levels of access to green space and green space quality. And these are youths, so from age 5 to about 20. And so it's natural for kids to be pretty pro-social, because we are as humans. So this is before adulthood and, you know, the competitiveness that comes from adult society takes over and squashes our prosociality. We are naturally pro-social as kids. But they find that kids are far more pro-social, or even more pro-social, when they have access to green space. And that is true through all of these years of being a kid. So even, you know, even kids with lots of access to green space, as they're as they enter high school, they become less pro-social. But those who have access to green space remain far more pro-social than those who don't. So green space is not the only solution, right? But what is it about green space that makes us care more about others? This is very provocative and interesting to me.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one more question. It says, are you planning to look at citizen assemblies and how these are supported by governments in the context of trust, complex/complicated topics, collaboration and consensus, etc.?
There's such good work right now on understanding citizen-based democracy, this deliberative democracy where people come together, whether it's to devise legislation, or if it's just to come to a mutual understanding. What happens when you put people together in a room? And so Ellen Landemore, Larry Lessig, James Fishkin, there are a set of people who are doing super good work on this. And I would recommend that you look at some at the results of their studies.
Great. Jenna, thank you so very much for joining us this morning. And we wish you luck, because it's not that it's just an interesting topic. It's a subject of necessity if we were not only to survive but to thrive. While much of the work at the center is looking at ethical framing and transformative values and its place in public policy. I think these are the questions of the hour in terms of how can we actually promote human social flourishing, especially sort of redefining governance. It took us decades to move away from GDP as the norm for progress in any given society to actually look at civic health and other issues. So we very much look forward to what you discover, what you come up with, what your team proposes in months and years to come. So thank you so much, Jenna. And thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Tenzin.